Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming, assembled live audience and out there in TV land. Uh, this is our first live streamed lecture from the Wells Reserve at Laudholm. Thanks for being a part of it. We thank our partners at the Maine Monitor and the Pulitzer Center that are helping make this salt marsh panel discussion tonight reality and a new experiment for us. I mean, this is a place of science. We love to experiment here. For 40 years, the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve, this place, has been studying these salt marshes, protecting them, educating people about them, and performing scientific research in our research lab, right behind this building here. It's a place that you can visit all year long. We have a number of programs that are always underway here, camps for the kids, kayak tours through the salt marshes, through that river right there. Lectures, guided walks, big festivals that happen here. We just had an outdoor concert last week in the balmy month of March. There are more concerts coming up this summer, but in general, 60,000 people a year find this place to be a tranquil and unique spot. There are only 30 of these national estuarine research reserves around the entire country. This is the only one in Maine. And it's the only one that has a nonprofit partner, of which I am the head. My name is Nick Charo. Thank you for joining us tonight. To learn more about this place, go to wellsreserve.org. That is the website, wellsreserve.org. If you found this online, then you found the website already. But thank you for being here. And thank you again to our partners at the Maine Monitor for what promises to be a very deep and profound discussion on salt marshes. All right, take it away.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Nick. And thank you to everybody who's joining us in person and online. My name is Kate. I am the editor of the Maine Monitor. For those who don't know us, we are a nonprofit investigative news outlet. We cover the entire state of Maine. I am delighted to be here in such a beautiful place and so grateful to the Wells Reserve for hosting us to talk about Maine's coastal wetlands. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of an introduction and to sort of frame the conversation, and then I will introduce our wonderful panelists who we have here tonight, and then we will dive right into some questions, a little bit of discussion, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. I'm going to venture a guess that the folks who are watching and in person with us tonight are lovers of coastal wetlands, just a guess. I know there are a lot of you out there. But I would say that for a lot of American history, wetlands have been considered more of an impediment than an asset. They're full of mosquitoes, they're very mucky to cross, they're hard to farm. So for a long time, I would say the consensus among sort of early settlers and commercial interests, and oftentimes the federal government, was that the best way to deal with these fresh and saltwater marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens was to extract their resources and turn them into land that was drier and generally more hospitable to humans. There are few, if any, coastal wetlands in Maine that have not been altered by humans in some way, which, as we will talk about tonight, has dramatically altered the way that those marshes function. Since the Revolutionary War, the continental United States has lost more than half of its 200 million acres of wetlands, and I'm talking about fresh and saltwater wetlands, according to estimates from the U.S. Geological Survey. Much of that has been lost to farming, but also to houses, strip malls, marinas, and other development. Maine's marshes are actually better off than much of our New England neighbors, in which development in and around wetlands ran rampant, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. Fully a quarter of the state of Maine, more than 5 million acres, remains wetland. And again, that's fresh and saltwater wetland, which is 4 times the wetland area of the 5 other New England states combined. However, only 3% of those 5 million acres are tidal wetlands, which play a unique role in supporting coastal ecosystems, storing carbon, and mitigating the effects of flooding. Tidal wetlands are also increasingly squeezed by development and rapidly rising seas, and their ecosystems are threatened by polluted runoff. So that brings us to our conversation today, where we are going to be speaking with several experts who have been working in coastal wetlands around the state for, in some cases, decades, trying to figure out how to solve some of these problems and ensure Maine's coastal marshes thrive into the next century. So Jacob, all the way over here, directs the community and site-based stewardship program at the Wells Reserve. He manages priority habitat and species in cooperation with state and federal partners and advances coastal habitat conservation through local and regional initiatives. Recently, he supported the development of Climate Ready Coast Southern Maine, the first coastal resilience plan in Maine, as well as the development of the new coastwise approach for ecologically supportive tidal road crossing design, which we're going to talk about a little bit. Jacob lives with his family in Biddeford, where he recently served on the Biddeford Climate Task Force to develop a climate action plan for the city. Susan Adamowitz, PhD, has more than 30 years of experience in estuarine ecology and salt marsh restoration. As the land management research and demonstration biologist for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, she is stationed at the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, where she's working to implement innovative restoration approaches on more than 300 acres of marsh in 4 different estuaries. Her FWS Northeast region responsibilities extend from Maine to Long Island. A lot of marshes. And Jeremy Gabrielson is Senior Conservation and Community Planner for Maine Coast Heritage Trust, where he has worked since 2014. His work at MCHT focuses on conservation of natural places and responses to climate change. In addition to tidal marsh protection, Jeremy has a strong interest in coastal resilience, coastal access, and locally driven economic development in rural communities. He serves on the Beginning with Habitat Steering Committee and the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Maine Climate Council, and works closely with partners to provide and interpret scientific and spatial data from state and national sources to inform local decision-making. Prior to working at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, he worked as a regional planner with the Washington County Council of Governments. Today, Jeremy lives in Cape Elizabeth with his wife and 2 sons and has served in several appointed roles in town government, and he's currently a member of the Cape Elizabeth Town Council. So I'd actually like to sort of kick off the discussion by asking each one of our panelists to just tell me a little bit about your work in the state's coastal wetlands. Give us a sense of why you started in this field and what your jobs actually look like on a daily basis. So I'm just going to go down the line. So Jeremy, can I start with you?
Great, sure. So as you mentioned, my background is in land use planning. I started my professional career working with communities in Eastern Maine. And when I came to Maine Coast Heritage Trust, I knew virtually nothing about marshes or tidal wetlands other than having worked as a land use planner and looking at sort of regulatory use of tidal wetlands and regulatory setbacks. So I've learned a lot over the last 10 years. A lot of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis is with folks who are on our staff, both working with landowners to protect tidal wetlands, and then also with our stewards who are taking care of places that we have protected either by purchasing them or through conservation easements.
Yeah, thank you. Susan?
Well, thanks for inviting me here this evening. I'm always very eager to talk about salt marshes, as folks know. I'll just say that I was born and raised in Rhode Island and lived just up the road from a salt marsh. But like many folks who come from the smallest state in the nation, when I went to college, I needed to get out. So I went to the University of Vermont, where I studied montane forests, and then to Indiana University, where I studied hardwood forests. Then I came home to New England, and particularly in southern New England, realized that there weren't quite so many forests, and there were already probably enough forest professionals out there. And as I like to say, after UVM, everything was downhill. So I returned to my first love, which was salt marshes, because that's where I played as a kid. My first pets were red mussels, believe it or not, what my mom put up with. And I ended up studying the shallow end of the oceans and came up here to Maine to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm in a very unique program that's focused on the salt marsh ecosystem. I spend half of my time at Rachel Carson, 2/3 of my time throughout the rest of the region, largely for the the first 2/3 of my 20 years, helping people to understand salt marshes, to assess their status, their integrity, and to undo obvious human alterations. And then I thought, 2018 hit and, all the exciting stuff was done. I was just going to cruise into retirement. And a colleague of ours, Jeff Wilson, began to uncover, to reveal to us more information about the farming history. And my excitement blossomed, and innovative ideas just sort of began to flourish. And so now I work with partners to reassess our salt marshes in that regard, and to work with them to design innovative restoration techniques that help the marshes cope both with their altered past and with climate change for the future.
We're going to talk a lot about this.
Yeah.
Jacob.
Well, I'm from Maine originally. I grew up in a town called Brooklyn, which is up the coastal ways. And so I have a strong affinity for the coast, for the ocean. I spend a lot of time on or near the ocean. And I've always wanted to have a job that had a meaningful impact on the world, and to provide a positive influence on my community. And all that sort of funneled into a serendipitous arrival here at the Wells Reserve in 2008, not really knowing exactly what I was hoping to do with all of that passion, but winding up getting an AmeriCorps job through the Maine Conservation Corps. So very entry-level position, supporting a conservation plan for the town of Sanford, or the city of Sanford, Maine, and working on at that time, a new website, which was essentially a database for coastal watershed information, which is now defunct. Websites actually need maintenance, and we found that out the hard way. But so anyway, so that was my foot in the door. But I quickly discovered that I loved working in coastal ecosystems and working in salt marshes and coastal rivers in particular. And our first and former research director, Michelle Dion, gave me a job, my first job in the environmental world. I started off doing mostly monitoring, so collecting long-term data on abiotic water quality as part of our system-wide monitoring program, which is a program of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. We all collect that data. I started working in our coastal streams, monitoring fisheries. I was doing electrofishing, I was doing pike netting, dip netting, working with volunteers, monitoring change at our beaches, and monitoring water quality in our local rivers. And over time, I just kind of kept doing that work, and all of a sudden I found myself getting involved with habitat restoration. And early on, I started working with partners on some local initiatives to advance aquatic habitat connectivity in our streams for anadromous fish. So alewives, brook trout, sea lamprey, American eel, other fish that migrate into our rivers every year. Their habitat and their access to that habitat has been disrupted by road building, dams, bridges, culverts. So I started working in that realm, and then that naturally progressed into working in coastal habitats, looking at tidal road crossings, which also create habitat discontinuities. Not as much for fish, because a lot of these coastal road crossings are much bigger in size. They tend to be bridges, which fish can get under, but they disrupt the flow of the tide, which has a negative impact on our salt marshes. And then my work has just blossomed in that field from there. And you asked, what does a week in my work look like? Most of my time is spent, at least this time of year, in meetings and responding to emails. that's really where a lot of the work gets done, because most of the work that I do, in any case, relies on partnerships. And here at the Wells Reserve, we don't actually own a lot of salt marsh. Most of the salt marsh that's within the reserve is actually part of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Wildlife Refuge. They manage the land. But we have a lot of community partners, municipalities, land trusts, private landowners, and even the refuge that can use support in managing those resources. So while we are not salt marsh owners, we are salt marsh experts, and we can provide technical assistance to those communities who are not experts. So I spend a lot of time writing grants. And some of the most recent work that we've been doing involves helping to support community resilience to sea level rise and climate change, while also supporting ecological resilience. And so we've been working with a number of communities in southern Maine to secure funding to make their roadways more sustainable, while also upsizing and improving those road crossings to allow the natural functioning of those systems to resume, and to allow both the roads and the salt marshes to adapt to sea level rise and cope with the coming changes that are going to occur in the next few decades.
Well, thank you very much for those introductions. Susan, I would like to start with you. Could you just give us a sense of the history of salt marshes in Maine? You know, what have they been used for in the past, and how has that impacted what they look like today?
So I won't give the long history of when the glaciers melted and
Sort of
Seacoast was miles and miles away from where it currently is. Well, we know that estuaries form where rivers meet the sea. In a very simple definition of an estuary. And salt marshes are those vegetated lands that form at the edge of uplands and the sea. And they're characterized by perennial grasses. We know, we have a very small understanding that the indigenous peoples used salt marshes and harvested food from them, but I don't really have any further notion of what that means. So everything else that I'm going to talk about will start with the early European settlers, but I don't want to ignore the indigenous presence that was here for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. But when the Europeans did come to the East Coast, they brought with them their livestock and their knowledge of agriculture. And they arrived to a forested landscape. Then the only meadows that were then available were the salt marshes. And they knew from their home countries that these marshes could be exceptionally valuable resources. And in some historic documents that I've found, the cost per acre of salt marsh was 5 times that of inland areas. Just saying. And so we know because of that and other things that these were very valuable to the survival of the early settlers. And the initial alterations that were done were just small, shallow drainage networks that allowed the tidal waters to drain off more rapidly and encourage growth of certain grasses that were more palatable and more nutritious to the livestock that they had with them. That was in the 16 and 1700s. By the early 1800s, and if you're thinking industrial revolution, that's the right mindset, because in the early and mid and late 1800s, there was an entirely new arrangement of ditching and embanking, or building small to large berms and dikes on the marsh in a grid pattern that we can still see today with a careful eye. And so the early farmers could just about double the production of the salt marsh grasses compared to, prior times. In the 1800s, they could quadruple the amount. So it was really beneficial to them to get the plumbing right, even on small parcels, like a quarter acre was not too small to do a little bit of work to increase the drainage and get your favorite grasses growing there. Initially, they were all salt marsh grasses, but as time went on, closer towards the upland edge, they could, again, through diking and ditch features, they could freshen those lands, the marsh, right up against the upland edge and grow upland grasses or even row crops. So the upland grasses like Timothy, for example, are slightly brackish tolerant, can tolerate a little bit of salt, and they had a commercial value as well as a sustenance value, for the home farm, so that they could actually sell the Timothy on the market. And then we had the Civil War and expansion out west, and people left. And I disagree with you a little bit about your characterization of how people valued salt marshes when they first arrived. They can host a lot of mosquitoes, and certainly last year they did. But they were highly valued by the folks that farmed, not only, lived not only right adjacent to that, but they were so valuable that people who lived inland would maintain small strips of salt marsh so that they could harvest the salt hay. And so we live with the legacy of these alterations, the drainage or the plumbing network that I like to call it, the embankments, the sperms that are left behind. We can see them right here in the little river. There are water control structures called trunks, which look like a big wooden box, and they were made of oak or chestnut. And so it's just an amazing wealth of culture that are in our marshes. And because they're no longer maintained as farming units, the plumbing network has clogged. And what we're seeing now is the ramifications of that clogged plumbing and concomitant sea level rise. So we've got sort of this double whammy going on. One or the other might have been okay, but because they're both coming on, we're now seeing severely impacted salt marshes.
I was actually thinking, and I bet you know a lot more about this than I do, but when I was thinking of the mosquitoes, I was thinking of the Works Progress Administration.
Yes, the
and
WPA. Yeah.
yeah, and can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that and
Yeah. Well, I could talk.
yeah.
This is
Bring us into the
Yes.
21st
So
century.
So we know that mosquitoes like to breed in areas of still water. So if the tide isn't rushing in and out, if the streams aren't flowing, if there's a little bit of pooling, or if there's cracked mud that gets wet every couple of weeks with the rainfall, that can breed mosquitoes. And mosquitoes, as we know, certainly these days can carry harmful diseases, deadly diseases. And following the Civil War, interestingly, malaria was brought from the south to the north with the returning soldiers. And so I won't say starting in the 1600 or 1800s rather, but certainly following the Civil War, it was really important to control mosquitoes. And I've got some slides from the state of Connecticut where they show people casting some kind of oil on top of the surface to kill the mosquito larvae. And the Works Progress Administration, WPA, in the 1930s or the Great Depression was an effort to put people to work. And part of that work involved excavating mosquito ditches through most every single salt marsh on the East Coast. Maine escaped a lot of that, which is why we get to see these farming footprints so much more readily than in states just to our south. And the folks, the men that worked in the mosquito ditching operations, they brought the peat cutting materials, the tools from Ireland, to cut the peat in the hay, or in the salt hay, and they were paid by the linear foot. So if you're paid by the linear foot, sort of like Charles Dickens being paid by the word, you know you're going to get a lot of it. And so that's in part why we have so many mosquito ditches up and down the East Coast, particularly around settled areas. It was both a public health concern, but you also had a labor population there to put to work. After World War II, with the development of petrochemicals and pesticides, there was a lot of use of DDT on the salt marshes as an adulticide to kill the adult mosquitoes. And then following Rachel Carson, we learned that broadcast use of these heavy pesticides was not healthy for the environment or the human population. And so an alternate technique was developed called open marsh water management, or OMWAM. And that was a process used to construct pools, so little excavated pools in the salt marsh connected with radial ditches to allow the mummichogs, the fish, to stay on the marsh platform in between tides and eat all the little mosquito larvae. So every 30 years or so, we seem to have a new management technique, and it's like looking at multiple layers of GIS, you know, all imposed on one of them. Or for maybe some of the older folks in the audience might recall Mr. Spock's three-dimensional chess. And so that's how I view all these management techniques on the salt marshes. It's happening in 3 dimensions, or occurred in 3 dimensions. And now we have to peel back the layers to understand how they're all interconnected.
That's fascinating. Yeah, the farming piece, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but the farming piece is really interesting. And I know you've done quite a bit of work in that arena. Jacob, so we just heard sort of the commercial and sustenance value of the marshes. Can you talk to us about the ecological importance and, basically for people who might be entering into this with very little knowledge of the salt marsh, why should they care? Why is this a place that they should care about?
Yeah, raise your hand if that's you. I was kidding. They're extremely important for supporting wildlife. So there's numerous bird species that use our wetlands. There's numerous fish species and vertebrates. There are upland mammals that visit the salt marsh to find food and forage. So just from an intrinsic natural value, wetlands are extremely important just for themselves, separate from what we humans can derive from them. But in addition to the natural value that salt marshes have, they do have a lot of value for us, for our built communities, because they provide what we call ecosystem services, if that term is still in use. And so some of those services include absorbing runoff and mitigating pollutants. So we humans put a lot of nutrients into the watershed, nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers, petrochemicals running off of our driveways, all the different stuff we put on our lawns and throughout our windows, and that all runs downhill when it rains, right? And so the marshes are like a sponge, and they soak that up and they filter all that stuff out, and what you get out of it is more or less clean water. So our marshes are a natural filtration system. Our marshes provide what we call a buffer against waves and coastal flooding. So the vegetation in the marsh actually dissipates the wave energy and protects our shorelines from erosion. The marshes are a sponge that actually, they're porous and they actually soak up water when we have storm surge and flooding. So areas that are buffered from the ocean by salt marshes will see less flood impacts than those areas that don't have salt marshes next to them. And then you mentioned blue carbon, so carbon storage. Salt marshes are really effective at storing atmospheric carbon as long as they're healthy and they're not degrading. And that's sort of an interesting caveat to the whole blue carbon discussion. There's a lot of interest now in the function of marshes and their ability to store carbon, but there needs to be a recognition of the fact that they're also degrading. And when they degrade and that peat starts to decompose, guess what? All that carbon is going back into the atmosphere. So that's why it's really important to protect them and to restore them. I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. And then just the last thing I'll mention, well, two other things I'll mention. They're incredibly important nurseries for fish, so commercially important fisheries, recreationally important fisheries. And they're also really wonderful places to recreate. So people love bird watching there, they love boating there, and they smell great. And I probably missed a few things. But.
Can I just tell a really quick
Oh,
story?
of course, yeah.
So you talk about salt marshes as being nurseries. I was down at Furbish Road a couple of years ago before the pandemic, right? And I saw a small schoolie striped bass, about this big, and but it was dead. It was on the rocks. It was low tide. And being my father's daughter, I jumped down off the road and I went over to the dead fish to, see if I couldn't understand what had killed it. And there was this big hook right next to it on the rock. And I thought, well, that's really curious. So maybe the hook had lodged in its throat or something. And so I went and I held the fish. I opened its mouth to see what kind of damage might have been done by a hook or something. And in the back of its throat was a little mummy chug. So one of these minnows, and most of the fish that we catch in the salt marshes, like 80% of them, right, are mummy chugs. And so I shook the fish and the mummy chug popped out. I thought, well, that was pretty fun. So I shook it some more and I squeezed its stomach and I got over 10 mummy chugs and 3 worms out of that little fish. And it was just so amazing. We talk about this thing called trophic transfer, where the production or the energy of the salt marsh, the food that it produces, gets transferred out of the salt marsh system into the larger world beyond. And that striped bass was such a perfect example, because that's a migratory fish that's going to go out into the ocean and travel up and down the coast. And it's taking that poor little guy wouldn't, because it was dead, but its brother or sister would take the energy of our Furbish Road salt marsh all up and down the East Coast. That's pretty cool.
And just to build on that in terms of some of the fisheries values too, one of the other things that I find really interesting about salt marshes is that a lot of our salt marshes, many of them coexist with other intertidal habitats, particularly mudflats. And both at the ecosystem level, there's this dynamic sort of interplay between sediments from the mudflats that get activated by the tides or lifted up by ice, helping to feed the salt marsh and actually helping it to accrete soil. But then also that nutrient transfer that's taking place and moving nutrients out onto those mudflats and helping support the productivity of them for, things that we care about and eat, like soft shell clams. But also for a whole bunch of macroinvertebrates. And you can see that really clearly if you visit a lot of Maine's intertidal habitats, just watching the shorebirds move back and forth from mudflats to the marsh in this tidal cycle as they're moving around and trying to find food in these connected systems.
And so many of those birds are migratory.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so they're taking the energy all up and down the East Coast.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about migratory animals and trophic transfer, I mentioned diadromous fish earlier, and so estuaries are extremely important for supporting those juvenile diadromous fish like Atlantic salmon and alewives as they migrate back down to the oceans. Those fish historically were extremely important for coastal ecosystems because they're one of the few mechanisms for actually taking nutrients and energy from the ocean and bringing it back to the land in the form of massive, massive schools of fish that return to our rivers every year. They're starting to do so more and more as we take down dams and restore our rivers, and the Penobscot River is one of the true success stories of that right here in Maine. But there's been an extreme, a massive impact to our coastal ecosystems with the decline of those anadromous fish. So salt marshes really play an important role in supporting those populations as well.
Yeah.
Good point.
I want to get to the sort of the point of this whole discussion, which is that, you know, as we've mentioned, Maine's tidal wetlands are sort of increasingly kind of under pressure from all kinds of different areas. And I think, Susan, it was actually you who first taught me this term, which is the coastal squeeze, where, you know, you've got these more rapidly rising seas, and then you have all of this coastal development that is preventing these marshes, which would, you know, if we had never existed, they will, or in places where we do not exist, you know, they have space and room to sort of roll inland, and they would migrate. Maine Coast Heritage Trust has been doing a lot of work on with its partners around the state in looking for places for marshes to migrate. I want you to, if you could, tell me, sort of give me a little bit of history of that work and when it started, and also, you know, just so we all have sort of a shared language. I'd like for you to talk about the different kinds of conservation, like how do you go about identifying a good place for a marsh to migrate, and then what happens when somebody says, hey, there's room for this marsh, like let's figure out how to make this work. Tell me how that works.
So I'll just back up and start with Maine Coast Heritage Trust. So we're a land trust that works up and down the coast of Maine, and everywhere that we work, we're working in partnership with other conservation groups. So there's other land trusts, there are state and federal agencies that are also working to protect land in those places as well. So we both do work where we will work with landowners to purchase the land or purchase an easement and that we hold, but we also do a lot of work with other partners helping to support their conservation efforts. And whether you're talking salt marshes or upland or, you know, any other types of habitats, the two basic tools that we have for that are what we refer to as purchasing or purchasing in fee simple or purchasing an easement. And the way that I like to think about this, fee simple is the term of art, but basically it just means when you buy property, there's a whole bundle of rights that come with that. And if you buy the property, most people, when they buy their house, they purchase it in fee simple. Just means that whatever you're legally allowed to do with that property, you can do. And so the idea of an easement is that one of the things that you can do as a landowner is sell some subset of those rights. And so most typically with easements, what happens is you own a property, you can build X number of houses on it or a strip mall or whatever you might want to put there. When a land trust purchases an easement, we're buying the right to develop that property. The landowner still owns the land. If they have a house on it, they still live there. They have all of the rights that they haven't sold to the land trust. But usually it's the development rights that they sell. So those are the two basic tools that we have in land conservation. And that applies to, you know, land trusts as well as towns, state agencies, federal government. When I started working at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, we, as a land trust that works in coastal Maine, were looking at climate change impacts up and down the coast and trying to understand what were some roles that we could be playing as a land trust to support climate resilience. And so that's what led us to look at tidal marshes and initially at one aspect of tidal marshes response to sea level rise, which we call marsh migration. This is basically the idea that as sea level rises, the water is going to move further inland. And these marshes have to live at a certain elevation. They have to get flooded periodically, but also have that water drain off of them. They can't be. And so as that tide moves inland, the zone that can support marsh grasses is also going to move inland. And when I first started at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, we had just started this work. They put this on my desk. And I thought, oh, this is great. This is a geospatial problem. We can figure out where the sea level rises. We can figure out which of those areas are undeveloped. Like this is a simple problem to solve, right? Oh, well, I was wrong. But the basic premise of it is still the same. Essentially, what we do when we're looking at marsh migration is we're looking at places where there's a migration space, a space that's upland now, but it will support marsh in the future. And then we can reach out to the landowners who own that land and start talking with them about conservation options, which could be us purchasing. It could be working with them to craft an easement, or it could just be them being aware of the resource that they have on their land and managing it in a way that's consistent with that change in habitat happening over time. So we've been doing that work for a number of years. And my mental model when we started was just that. The sea is going to rise, the marsh is going to move inland, everything is great with the world, right? Well, it turns out that because of a lot of the impacts to tidal marshes that Susan was talking about, as well as various impacts from road crossings and other tidal structures, that movement of the marshes inland is not as simple as undeveloped land at the right elevation becomes marshes. You also have to pay attention to how the water is moving onto and off of that marsh area. And when there's roads that are impeding that full tidal restriction, you're not going to get marsh because the salt water is not getting to where it needs to get to. So there's other parts of that work that have come in, and that includes working with towns and the DOT on looking at road crossings, and also working with Susan and folks who are doing that marsh platform restoration to make sure we're paying attention to the hydrology.
Yeah, well, actually, I think I'm gonna move around a little bit here. So sort of speaking of tidal restrictions, which have made this work much more complicated than you anticipated. Jacob, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work on the tide gate at Drake's Island Road, and so give us a little bit of history there, and tell us what has happened to sort of the marsh on the north side of the gate since the self-regulating gate was installed in 2005, I believe. 2004. Okay. Yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about that and what the marsh looked like before and sort of what it looks like now.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we won't go back to the last ice age.
No.
And now we know what it looked like during the 16, 17, 1800s, because Susan explained that to us. So Drake's Island Road appeared in around 1895, approximately. And it is the sole, more or less the sole access, at least for vehicles, on and off of Drake's Island for all the residents that live down there and for people that go to the beach and anybody that finds their way down there. And at one time, there was a small culvert under that road. This is before my time, so I'm reciting things that I've come to know since I started working here. And it had what's called a flapper gate, or essentially a circular cover on a hinge that covered up the inlet of that culvert. And it would, at low tide, when the water wasn't at that elevation, it would allow some fresh water from upstream that was running off of the farm here and different areas upstream. It would allow that to go out. But when the tide came in, the pressure of the incoming tide would essentially just push that shut. And so it prevented all salt water from getting upstream. And the culvert was so small that it really didn't even allow effective drainage of the fresh water that was collecting on the upstream side. And so it was essentially a freshwater wetlands, open water pond in some places. And it had been like that for a long time. Then in the 1990s, that flapper valve fell off. It corroded, it broke, something happened to it, it fell off, it went away. And all of a sudden, that marsh was allowed to drain out and salt water was allowed to start getting in there. And so the freshwater wetland started to convert to salt marsh, which is what happens when you introduce salt water to a freshwater wetland. The freshwater plants can't tolerate the salinities, they start to die off, and then those areas are colonized by salt tolerant species that we find in our salt marshes. So it started converting to salt marsh. Then the community wanted to, some years later, the community wanted to fix that flapper valve. They wanted to put it back on and put things back the way they were, at least within their frame of reference. And as they worked through that process of trying to move that project forward and get it permitted, the state of Maine, the Department of Environmental Protection said, no, you can't do that. This is now salt marsh. It's been salt marsh for several years now. You can't change the hydrology of this site to convert it back to fresh water. We have laws against that. We don't allow that to happen. So that then spawned this whole process of trying to figure out what to do with that site. And in addition to, well, one of the main concerns for the landowners was flooding in their backyard for folks that had frontage on that, what they call the 30-acre marsh. And so their properties flooded during big rain events when that little culvert wouldn't pass all the water through. And they were worried about storms and tidal flooding. And so at some point, the Wells Reserve and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got involved, and they said, well, you know, let's come up with a solution here that allows us to maintain the salt marsh, and even allows it potentially to improve, for conditions and functions in the marsh to improve, and also addresses the concerns of the residents and the need for maintaining the road and the road crossing. And so the idea, you know, I think there were a number of studies, engineering firms were involved, and what they ultimately decided on was what's called a self-regulating tide gate. So self-regulating sort of implies that you put it in and it kind of does its thing. And then the tide gate is exactly what it sounds like. It's a gate that controls the tides. But the idea is that this device, it's not just a flapper gate, which I guess is also technically a tide gate. It also it has floats, and it has different settings on it that can be adjusted so that it can allow a certain amount of tide to get up through it. And then there's a process of figuring out how much is the right amount and then dialing that in, and then you set the gate and you kind of let it do its thing. There was also the idea that this gate could be manipulated to mitigate the effects of coastal storms. So if there's going to be a big flood event and people were worried about too much tide getting through that gate, adjustments could be made. The gate could be shut down temporarily until that storm was over, and then they could reopen it and allow things to continue. I won't go, there's a whole sort of history around the tide gate, relations with residents on the island, mistakes that were made in the installation of the gate. And I won't go into all of that, but what I will say, and when I came to the reserve, that was sort of in the early years of post installation, while the reserve was still working with the town and the residents to figure out the right settings on the gate. What was the right amount of tide to let in to that marsh? And the short story there is that they kind of got it up to a certain point, and then there was a lot of disagreement about making any further changes, and so things just kind of stagnated there. And so my initial impression of this project when I got here was that it was really controversial, and it left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. But over time, as I've become more and more familiar with the project, I think what I've decided, and I don't know if other people would agree with me, is that the project actually achieved what it set out to do. And I'll just for a couple reasons I'll say that. So number one is that it certainly has allowed is reduced the upstream freshwater flooding. So now when we have big rain events, that pond no longer fills up and floods people's backyards. It's allowed to flow out on the outgoing tide, and it doesn't stick around for very long. So that's success number one. Success number two is that marsh upstream, because it was underwater for so long and because of the farming history there, that peat and that the marsh elevation compressed and it sunk. It did what we call subsiding. And so if you stand on at that site at low tide and you look at the marsh downstream towards the ocean, and then you turn and you look at the marsh upstream, if you're observant, you can tell that the marsh is actually on the upstream side is much lower than it is on the downstream side. And what that means is that on a high tide, that marsh is going to be much more underwater than the marsh downstream. And those are not conditions that would allow that marsh to persist. That's too much flooding. The vegetation would not tolerate it. Eventually it would all die off, and that whole area would convert to mudflat. So the presence of the tide gate actually is preserving that marsh by restricting the amount of flooding that it receives, so that the salt marsh vegetation can actually survive. And there are caveats to that statement. There's a lot of Phragmites, which is an invasive species in that area. That wouldn't be there if there was full tidal flow, because Phragmites can't tolerate full tidal flooding. There's a lot of that area upstream, which is freshwater, and it has shrubs and trees and stuff growing in it. And all of that, and we're talking about marsh migration, there's a significant area upstream of there that with sea level rise would become salt marsh in the future. So the tide gate is not a permanent solution to maintaining the salt marsh upstream, but for the time being, it has been a pretty good solution. And we know from our partners at the refuge that it's actually a really important area for breeding salt marsh sparrows, which are a species of bird, for whatever reason, decided to start building its nests right above the surface of the marsh, where it has about 27 days to lay eggs, hatch, and fledge their chicks before the spring tides come back in and wipe the nests out. But it seems to have worked out for them in places where we haven't messed with the hydrology, which is just about everywhere. So anyway, so the tide gate, I would say, is actually a success story, but the future of that site, I think, is in question. And if you look at the surrounding area, it doesn't exist in isolation. The recent storm events that we had showed that Drake's Island floods from multiple different directions, including our Barrier Beach Trail, which goes down to the beach here. Water comes in over the sand dunes and washes down Drake's Island Road and then into the marsh. And we actually saw after the January 10th and 13th storms that area upstream of the tide gate didn't drain out because there was so much tide water that it overtopped the bowl, and then the little spout, the drainage of the bowl wasn't enough to allow all of that to flow out. So it held a lot of water for a long time. And so someday the tide gate's not going to be the only thing that regulates the flow of the tides there. It's going to be coming in from different locations. So that needs to be considered when we're thinking about how to manage that site in the future.
And just to expand on that a little, I think what's interesting with that tide gate is it's an interesting example of a tidal restriction, and a lot of the issues and challenges that are exhibited on that site, you can see in other places where there are less intentional tidal restrictions, either because a road was built with a culvert that was too small, or maybe there was a small tidal dam that was put in at some point as a grist mill, features like that. a lot of those sites haven't received as much attention, but there's a lot of them out there. The Maine Coastal Program did an effort to map this a couple years ago, and they identified 940 crossings, road stream crossings and tidal dams in Maine, and virtually all of them act as a tidal restriction to some degree or another. Not all as severe as this one, but to some degree, they're impacting the marsh in similar ways, either delaying the tide, holding back the highest extent of the tide, or holding back fresh water that should be draining off and allowing those marsh plants to survive. So that's a big issue that we have to pay attention to as a state and within our communities, just figuring out how to deal with all of these 900 plus tidal restrictions that we have on the landscape.
And that's part of what the Coastwise project
That's
evolved
just-
as, and I'm not the best person at
Yeah.
all to speak about this, but it was an effort with the state of Maine, the coastal program, and many partners to develop a sort of a guidebook on how to address these tidal restrictions. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more, or Jay perhaps. But that's my understanding in a
Yeah.
nutshell.
Well, I'm happy to talk about Coastwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
If we're there, when we get there.
yeah, no, go
We're
ahead.
there.
Yeah,
We're there?
we're there.
All right.
Here we are.
Yeah, well, thanks for that intro. So, yeah, so tidal restrictions. So Jeremy mentioned there's lots of them. There's this great, so if you want to go online and do a internet search for the Maine Tidal Restriction Atlas, which is this wonderful online mapping tool that shows the locations of all of these, explains how the map was created. It also shows future tidal crossings. So the Maine Coastal Program used sea level rise projections to map the locations of places that will become tidal in the future. So it's a really great planning tool. A lot of us have been using this data over the last couple of years to identify projects and start planning for restoration of these sites. One thing that I hope we'll get to talk about is, I think for me, certainly when I started learning about tidal restrictions and the possibility that you could remove these things and allow the full flow of tide back in, that got me really excited. And I thought, oh, this is great. Let's find those road crossings and let's upgrade them or yank them out. And then I had folks like Sue, fortunately, come and say, well, hold on a second. Because we've got all these historic alterations to the marsh surface, the plumbing is all messed up. And if you open up these sites and you allow all this extra flooding to come in, you're going to really exacerbate the problems there. So I just want to, I'm going to talk about Coastwise, but I just want to caveat this with the explanation that removing tidal restrictions is not the end all be all to restoring these impacted marshes. And in fact, there's really a sequence of management actions that needs to be taken in the right order to have the effect that we want. And so before we remove tidal restrictions, the first thing that we need to do is fix the plumbing.
Right.
So
On
I'm sort of
both sides,
segueing
yeah.
back to you.
Yeah.
Anyway, but
Yeah.
I'll
That's okay.
just quickly talk about Coastwise since that was brought up. So Coastwise is a clever term that was modeled after another program in Maine called Stream Smart. So Stream Smart is based on a methodology that was developed by the United States Forest Service for essentially called stream simulation, and is essentially a method for making a road crossing invisible to the stream. So if you can imagine you're a fish swimming along in your stream, catching bugs, avoiding predators, and all of a sudden you come to a road crossing. What does that look like to you? Is that something that you want to swim through? Is that something that you're going to find inviting? Is that habitat for you? If it's a round corrugated metal pipe, or God forbid, PVC, smooth PVC pipe, it's dark, there's no rocks, there's no bugs, there's nothing in there except for fast moving water. No, you don't want to go in there. That's not your habitat. Now picture a big arching span that goes all the way from beyond the bank of the stream on one side to beyond the bank of the stream on the other. Underneath that big arching span are natural banks on either side of the stream. There's plenty of light getting in there. There's a natural channel bottom. And when a fish swims up to that, they don't even notice that road crossing. Oh, maybe it's a little dark in there, but they swim right through. It's no problem for them. So that crossings, the idea with stream simulation is that the crossing is invisible to the stream. And Maine adapted that into a slightly more simplified methodology called Stream Smart. But the idea was the same, that we want to be able to allow our road crossings to be ecologically supportive, allow the natural functions of our freshwater streams to occur, allow fish and other aquatic organisms to pass those structures, to do the things that they need to do. And StreamSmart has been highly successful. It's been developed over decades. There is a program of trainings for everyone from public officials, road managers, engineers, restoration practitioners, you name it. So those of us in Maine who have been working on aquatic connectivity, but also found ourselves working in salt marshes and coastal systems said, wait a second, this StreamSmart methodology is great, but does it apply to tidal systems? And as we dug into that question, we started to realize that the answer really was no. And so then the question was, well, what is the right methodology for designing these road crossings for tidal systems? And so that led to the development of Coastwise, which is a holistic approach to designing ecologically supportive, resilient, and cost-effective road crossings in the tidal environment. So ecologically friendly, I just sort of described that. So it's essentially providing all or most of the natural functions that would occur in the tidal system. Resilient, meaning that it can sustain changes from sea level and storm surge, sea level rise and storm surge. So designing a crossing that will function throughout its useful life, which in some cases might be 75 or even 100 years. And then what was the third thing I said? Cost effective, right? So cost effective. So this is a little. So as we are rolling Coastwise out, this is a sticking point for a lot of folks that we're talking to about this methodology because it's counterintuitive. Ecologically supportive crossings are generally bigger, and when you build something bigger, it costs more money. So when people see the price tag on these bigger crossings, a lot of times they have an immediate reaction to, oh wait, no, we can't do that. But when you look at the maintenance costs of smaller structures over the lifespan of the crossing, it actually, then the price tag actually makes more sense because you're not doing maintenance on that crossing. Undersized crossings we've seen in a lot of the big storms that have happened in New England in the last decade, particularly Hurricane Irene in Vermont, they lost hundreds of road crossings in that big storm event, washed out. Critical failure, roads collapsing, giant metal pipes, flipping end over end, washing downstream. It cost billions of dollars to deal with those issues. What Vermont did was really smart is when they built back those crossings, they upsized them. They used stream simulation methodology, they made them bigger. And then in the more recent storms that we've had, a lot of those crossings fared really well. And so, you know, you can imagine spending $200,000 on a culvert, a big culvert or a small bridge. If it's properly sized, that might be the last time that you have to spend that money on that crossing within its useful life. If you only spend $120,000 on a smaller crossing and that gets wiped out 2 or 3 times in its life, well, now you've spent triple what you spent initially. So it's a cost-effective way to build infrastructure, but you have to be thinking about the long-term costs, not just the short-term costs. And it's easier said than done because coming up with those upfront costs is challenging, and it really puts a lot of burden on municipalities, road managers who have to, you know, they don't operate on a 75-year budget. They operate on an annual budget, and they have to raise that money through taxes. And when you try to explain to people why you're spending $2.5 million on a bridge, you know, it's hard. So one of the roles that places like the Wells Reserve and Maine Coast Heritage Trust and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the roles that we can play is helping to bring in federal dollars and grant money to help pay for that infrastructure. And so that's why, when I said earlier that I spend a lot of time writing emails and building partnerships, that's what we're doing. We're trying to bring resources to these communities to help them do the right thing for their local environments and their natural systems. Because not only is it the right thing to do for the environment, but it also saves them money and it makes those communities more resilient to
Right.
climate change over time. So it's really like a win-win, but the question is, how do you do it? How do you make it happen? That's the challenge, and that's what we spend our time working on.
Is the coastwise approach being, so it's in use in Maine? I mean, are we seeing this being used to
So-
upsize
Yes,
culverts?
Yes,
Yeah,
sorry.
okay. Yeah.
yes, so, and I know I sort of didn't finish the thought there, but, so all of this work culminated in a manual, called the Coastwise Approach, and that's now available online. You can find it using Google or any your favorite internet browser. It's a fairly weighty document. It's great bedtime reading if you have trouble getting to sleep. It's also something that you can bring to your local road commissioner and say, hey, you should be doing, this is really interesting, you should read this. But we're not just putting the manual out there and saying, here, folks, this is what you should do. We're providing, we have a host of partners that are providing technical support, as I said, not only for design, but also for writing grants, for doing monitoring, all of the different pieces of a road replacement project. And we are now, we're about to roll out a training. So we've developed a pilot training, which is targeted at the engineering community, which we felt was the sort of the first line in the sort of road crossing pipeline, where we really need to get at those people because, ultimately, we could convince a town planner or a town council, you should build a coastwise crossing here. But then they need to go hire somebody to do that. And so that's the engineers, that's the consulting community. So we're going to be rolling out a 2-day training in May here at the Wells Reserve. We're going to be piloting this training. We're making it free to the participants so that we can pick their brains and evaluate this training, how effective it was, how, at communicating the principles of Coastwise. And then once we refined it a little bit, and we're going to adapt it to different audiences, we're going to roll it out statewide to all the coastal communities in Maine. Hopefully we'll be spreading the word to other New England states who are interested in doing this type of work. And hopefully over time we'll be as successful as the Stream Smart program, and we'll really integrate into the thinking of all these communities that are doing this work. And if we can do that effectively, we might start to see more and more of these coastwise crossings popping up in different places. And I'll also just say, I should mention also that the #1 manager of tidal road crossings in the state of Maine is the Maine Department of Transportation. And they're a massive organization. They have a way that they do things, and they are thinking about sea level rise, and they are thinking about how to make their infrastructure more resilient too. And a lot of that has been going on for years. We work closely with DOT, who is also very supportive of the municipalities when they're doing infrastructure work. And we've made sure that DOT has been heavily involved with the development of these guidelines. So we have the support of lots of the folks in the natural resources world. But we've also been working closely with transportation professionals who understand the nuts and bolts of managing roads and road crossings. So I think we're all really pleased with how Coastwise has come out. It's been a massive effort, and we're looking forward to rolling out those trainings and getting folks involved.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen, with the storms in the last few years, just so many different washouts and culvert collapses around the state. And I have wondered, what are they being replaced with? Are they being replaced with something that can actually withstand, future
The
storms?
last thing you want
Yeah.
to do is replace it with the same kind of thing that was there before,
Right.
which is the easiest thing to get permitted.
Mhm.
And because it's a known entity, it's the easiest thing to replace it with.
Yeah.
But it's less than a Band-Aid. And the prudent community, the prudent town road commissioner would take a look at the coastwise approach. And the prudent engineer would also look at the salt marshes on both sides of the road, knowing that each roadbed that crosses a salt marsh acts like a dam. And there are downstream effects of this barrier as well as upstream effects. And one of the downstream effects, when you have a road crossing and a small opening, is that the water that wants to get upstream can't. And so it ends up piling up on the downstream side of the road crossing and can potentially flood out homes or adjacent properties on the downstream side, as well as on the upstream side. You can't get the sediments up over that road that would normally feed the marsh and help provide elevation growth. And that's one of the reasons why you have that elevation disparity. And as you eloquently said, Jake, that when you reopen an area to full tidal flooding, you could easily drown the upstream marsh. And so what we need to do is prepare that marsh first so that it can heal, that the plumbing is all set up so that it can deal with the additional flows. And ideally you would phase in increased tidal flooding so that that upstream marsh would have an opportunity to gain an elevation before it's exposed to full tidal flooding. That's a very complicated process, often isn't done, but we are hopeful that moving forward, we'll be able to do some of that work.
It's also one of the reasons that so many of us are paying attention to this right now, because we're very cognizant in this community of folks who care about tidal marshes, that we're living in an era of rapid sea level rise. And so the ability of the tides to deliver sediment onto those marshes is really critical for those marshes' ability to respond to and adapt to sea level rise. And as Jake mentioned, a lot of these road crossings, once you put them in place, it's there for 60, 70, 80 years. And that's the exact window that we expect to see a lot of the more devastating, significant impacts of sea level rise on these marshes. So this is the opportunity that we have to get it right.
I want, we have questions from the audience and I want to ask some of them, but first, could you briefly talk, Susan, about, so we've talked a lot about, marsh migration, we've talked about these restrictions. A lot of your work has centered on, right, if you just remove the restriction, like Jake was saying, this does not solve the problem. In fact, it could make it worse. So a lot of your work is centered on how do you restore the functional hydrology for the surface of the marsh. Can you, I have to say that when I first started going out into these marshes, I just, I've grown up around marshes. I grew up around Scarborough Marsh, and I thought, like, this is just what marshes look like. I had no idea that somebody had been mucking around in them and moving things around
For hundreds of years.
For hundreds of years. And but if you look, now that I know what to look for, you go out and you can see, these embankments are they're just a little too straight, and there are too many right angles, for them to be sort of natural.
Right.
So what are you trying, what do these marshes sort of look like on the surface, and like, what are we trying to get to?
So one of the things that we've seen develop since the 20 teens, sounding like an old timer now, back in the 20 teens, was the formation of large areas of shallow standing water on the marsh surface where the vegetation has died back. And we call those areas megapools. I actually did my dissertation work on the New England salt marsh pools. So those steep sided, relatively small areas that hold water all throughout the growing season, and they're filled with the smelly muck on the bottom. It's a great place to study. And so those are like what we've been calling natural pools. These mega pools are very different. They're very large, amorphous in size. The water is shallow. The bottom of the pool is firm because it was peat. It was growing vegetation just a couple of years previous. And so that got our attention pretty quickly. I'd heard about this sort of thing happening in southern New England from friends and colleagues down there. I thought, well, I'm so glad it's not happening up here in Maine, and maybe that's because we have a bigger tidal range here, and that's helping to move the water off the marsh. Well, it was only a few years later that it started happening up here. And so that process of a vegetated marsh responding to a disturbance is called secondary succession. We can now sort of map out the progression of what's going to happen. And if there wasn't sea level rise, we think, well, the marsh will handle it. Eventually, it'll connect up to a creek and it'll drain and the vegetation will regrow again and everything will be fine. But because of sea level rise, while we have these megapools sitting on the marsh, the elevation is subsiding. It's a word that you mentioned earlier this evening. And as the elevation subsides and sea level rises, even if that megapool connects to a creek and drains, the bottom elevation is going to be so low at a certain point that it won't be able to regrow vegetation. It'll be covered by too much tidal water too much of the time. So working with other partners in an unofficial group we call SMART teams, Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency Teams, I corralled a number of my salt marsh professional colleagues from Maine to Maryland, and we get together monthly and discuss different restoration projects. And now we've actually started running workshops to train what we call local field teams, so local communities or groups of partners that are working together to restore a given marsh. And we teach them how to recognize these alterations on their marsh. We talk about secondary succession. We have these subsidence trajectory scenarios, and then the response is, well, how can we intercept that subsidence trajectory to start the marsh building in elevation again? And that has to do with restoring what we call single channel hydrology. We believe that prior to the Europeans arriving on this coast, each sub-tide shed or each tide shed within a marsh was drained by a single continuous channel that may have branched, but it all drained like a watershed on the mountainside, right? So all the streams flow into a common point out of that watershed. Well, the same thing with the tide sheds on a salt marsh, but it's much more subtle because the elevation change is like skin. And so what we've done is develop a restoration technique that looks at all the alterations at their footprint and identifies a single channel pathway on these superimposed ditch networks, where we get to choose where the drainage will be. And we, in some cases, will turn on a portion of a drainage system with a runnel, so a really shallow channel. We're not digging deep ditches anymore. That's like old history. We just want the water to drain within the rooting zone so that the plants are happy. You can overwater a house plant pretty easily and it dies. Well, that's what's happening in the salt marsh. There's too much water sitting in the roots. And so we just want the water table to lower just enough so that the roots stay happy. And we connect this up into a single channel system. And then we're going to turn off all the other drainage channels that might be out there. We do that through a process called ditch remediation, where we harvest the salt hay, we tamp it down into the bottom of the ditch and hold it down with twine. And we build up layers of that because the salt hay will act like filter paper. And on the outgoing tide, it'll filter sediments. And this combination of sediment and salt hay acts like the neighboring peat in the surrounding marsh. And we heal the ditch from the bottom up to an elevation where it can start to support plant growth. And so we quietly turn off the extra ditches and emphasize the single channel hydrology network. And by doing that and by making the plants happy, and we can gain elevation by the plants themselves on the marsh surface will filter out the sediments from the tidal water. And the bulk of our elevation in the salt marsh peat is actually the roots and rhizomes of the plants themselves. And when the plants are happy, they put down a lot of roots. The same thing with your house plants. That's why you have to repot them all the time. So if we can get the plant's happy, they're gonna filter sediments, they're gonna throw down a lot of below ground biomass, these roots and these rhizomes, and they'll gain in elevation. It's a slow process. So we're looking at things to do in the short term that can provide habitat for these salt marsh sparrows, which are a state endangered species. And we're also looking towards the long term. So we're in this for the long haul. This is not a one and done restoration technique. And as I like to say, we are now the farmers in the marsh.
Well, we have questions and oh, yeah. Just waiting so patiently. Yes, we'll do, I've got two here from the folks on Zoom so far but go ahead, you are. Yeah. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Rain.
I'm just looking at this, I'm not a scientist, half the stuff you're talking about, so I'm not getting it. I saw this in my email, and I thought it'd be really interesting, because I have a lot of concern about what I see going on.
Mhm.
I figured I'd come here, maybe I'll learn something, which I have, but a lot of it's very technical for someone like me, you know, just a lay person. Okay, so, I see, I've watched what's happened to the coast, living kind of I've watched what's happened over the past few months with these dangerous storms that we've had, with the water going up upside roads and into people's yards and the whole thing, okay? And then I see all the development and the pressure from the state for the 80,000 housing units that we're supposed to be building. And it could now put multiple, new housing units on what this originally a single family lot, okay? So what I see happening, which is I think they're squeezing sort of metaphor, is that all this development's going on. We have this, sea level rise, and it's just everything's going this way. The water's coming this way, and it's just the drainage. You see the water after the heavy rain running down all our roads and stuff. Like the drainage, what do you call it, to get all clogged. It's a huge mess. So when I saw the thing about the wetlands, I'm thinking, are they just going to disappear? And that's sort of my question to you is at some point the pressure, and I guess the question is when, at what point, is there going to be so much pressure on these wetlands because I always looked at them, I grew up in wetlands too. They're just going to disappear because they always were such a great sponge, for them.
They're going to move.
That's my word.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So in response to that, I mean, your concerns are spot on. So the more impervious surface, so the more roofs, parking lots, roadways that we have, will cause an increase in runoff of fresh water to the marshes. And what we really want to do is have that infiltrate into the ground as much as possible. It's first thing. The second thing is that as we're listening to the, I think, rain pound on the roof here, is that with climate change, we are both getting more rainfall each year, almost 10 inches more. Certainly 5 inches more, might be as much as 10 inches more. And it's coming in more severe storms. So it's harder for that amount of rain to infiltrate completely within these short bursts. So you get more runoff. And I see my task as delivering to the next generation as much existing acreage of salt marsh as I possibly can. And so that's the torch I'm going to pass on to the next generation. In the meantime, Jeremy is working and Jake's working to find these migration corridors so that as the sea level rises, the marshes can migrate and can continue to exist. That footprint is going to shift inland.
I did get that.
Yeah.
And I call that the belt and suspenders strategy from a concept. I mean, we really want to keep the marsh we've got. We want to make it as healthy as we can by paying attention to the hydrology and road crossing so that it can move up as a response to sea level rise. But then paying attention to places where there are natural areas next to those marshes so that marsh can move back it's kind of it's a no regrets strategy. That land protection piece, and hopefully what we can also do as part of that is pay attention to where there are places that aren't in that path of sea level rise, where we can look at accommodating development that is not going to be flooded out and threatened by sea level rise. One of the projects that we worked on MDI actually, I think was a really good use of the data that we have. I mean, this is a spatially very well-defined problem. And there was a property that had been slated as a subdivision on near the head of the island on MDI. They put the subdivision road in. The subdivision road is 3 feet above the highest annual tide. So in 2060, that will be the shoreline essentially, maybe 2070, maybe 2080, but somewhere in that range. And houses were going to go in there. We were able to work with the developer to purchase that property and bring it into conservation. So now there's forest that will eventually become salt marsh. It's also in a part of Bar Harbor where there is both a need for and availability for affordable housing. And the whole property that we purchased is not going to be flooded. There was, there's a 20-foot hill on the backside of it. So in that case, we were able to work with the Island Housing Trust there to carve off that portion of the property that's not threatened by sea level rise, that's less critical to the health and future of the marsh. And they're now developing affordable housing units there out of harm's way. And I think those are the kinds of solutions that we need to be looking at implementing on a broader scale coastwide, because we do have to walk and chew gum at the same time.
So when you see people putting walls up around their homes and so on, like along the coast, and
Right.
stuff, because people, building these
Right.
walls. And some of them, probably aren't that far from marshes and so on. Are those threatening the marsh as well, because it's just putting more and more water into the marsh?
That's a really tough question. Because if I were that homeowner, that's exactly what I'd do, right? And the state regulates those walls. So I believe they have to be grandfathered in most cases. And what generally happens is that when one seawall or one bulkhead goes in, it increases the erosive effect on the neighbor. So then the neighbor wants to put a bulkhead in, which then increases the erosive effect on the next neighbor down. And I think the preferred alternative, at least from my perspective, would be something that we call a living shoreline, where it's a softer, greener engineering. It's definitely engineered, but it incorporates the use of plants and other engineered materials to protect the shoreline, but to soften that erosive effect. So that's that's my preferred alternative. I will say though, that in real estate, the saying used to be location, location, location. It should now be elevation, elevation, elevation. And that's very true, in salt marshes. It's all about elevation and little bits. We're talking about millimeters of elevation growth per year as being, oh, whoopee, we got 10 millimeters a year. That's great. That's, like half an inch, right? That'd be really nice, right? And we think we can achieve something close to that once we fix the plumbing. Because sea level rise is at, 3 to 4, maybe 5, depending upon the different projections, and millimeters per year. Again, it's like hair's widths. But over time, as we know, it all adds up. The sea coast and the flooding water lines are not where they were when we were growing up. That's our frame of reference. It wasn't like what I used to know when I was a kid, and I want to restore it back to that. Well, I used to think a lot about restoration and restoring back to like pre-colonial conditions. We can't do that anymore. That's very clear. And what I think about now is restoring processes so that we can have a healthy ecosystem that can be resilient. And we were using all these buzzwords, but it means very real things to us. so these ecosystems can be resilient into the future. And resilience is being able to take a disturbance and recover from that, not just be, devastated, blown apart.
We're sort of at time, but we had one question that is sort of semi-related to what she was asking, which is that I'd like for, maybe Jeremy, you can start by addressing this, because I think you might be closest to this work, but what is the biggest challenge to getting, this sort of work done, restoration work, migration work? Is it funding? Is it practitioners? Is it buy-in from municipalities and property owners? Is it all of the above?
That's a great question. I can certainly take a crack at it, and Susan and I spend a lot of time thinking about these things. I think one of the challenges that we need to deal with right now is awareness. What we've been learning about salt marshes and historic farming practices and how that interacts with sea level rise is something that was known 100 years ago, but we're relearning that now, thanks to folks like Susan and Jeff Wilson and others. And it's a mental shift for a lot of folks who work in coastal conservation. And I will admit that when Susan started talking about this, I was a little skeptical, and then she started showing it to me, and now I can't unsee it. And I think what we need is more opportunities, and that's part of the training piece, is we need more opportunities for folks who are at all stages, landowners who are trying to figure out what to do with their property, funders who are trying to look at how to promote coastal resilience, road managers to have some opportunity to see what this looks like in practice. Funding is obviously always a challenge. This is just one coastal resilience need that we're running up against. In the grand scheme of things, tidal marsh restoration is not that expensive if you compare it to the funding need to address all of those tidal road crossings, which in turn is not all that expensive if you compare it to the adaptation needs for homeowners whose properties are threatened by sea level rise, or wastewater treatment plants that were built at an elevation that may have been right 20 years ago, but is not going to be right 20 years from now. And so there's a lot of needs out there, and figuring out the right balance and how to get those resources, that it's that three-dimensional chess game
Right.
we're trying to play right now.
Right.
And I think it also all points to the need for careful, proactive planning.
Yeah.
Community level planning and thinking about, we know changes are coming. We are going to lose salt marsh. We are going to lose coastal habitat. We are going to lose coastal communities. It's going to happen. 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, 3.9 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That is the planning targets that the state of Maine has identified for in the state climate action plan. So we know these changes are coming. The question is, what are we going to do to adapt, to protect things that need to be protected? And then, in some places we're going to have to make really hard decisions about letting go. And that is a hard reality that communities are going to have to start facing. And Kate, you had talked about, like, well, how do we react when a culvert gets washed out, and like, what do we do? What do we put back? Well, the fact is that we don't want to be reacting to these events, because by the time a culvert washes out or a home washes away, it's too late to plan for that event. You need to be making plans well in advance, getting people out of harm's way, getting infrastructure out of harm's way, so that when those events happen, and we know they're going to happen, and we're seeing them happen, there's less damage and it costs less money.
Less expensive.
It's less expensive.
Yes.
It's way more expensive to try to recover from these massive events, we have litter, debris all over our salt marshes from these last storm events. And you're just going to see more and more of this happening. Our roads are destroyed, in Wells here, we have massive damage from those coastal storms, and that happened up and down the coast. So Jeremy's right, like the salt marsh issue it's maybe smaller when you think about like the funding situation. And actually, right now, we are in like a unprecedented era of funding for doing coastal habitat work. So it's not that there isn't necessarily funding, we have to have the will to devote the resources to solving these problems. I know we need more funding, I'm not saying. Funders out there that are listening,
Yeah,
they still need more money.
No, we,
Um,
we need it in the right places.
Right.
Right, and it's not necessarily all in the right places right now. I was once told that if money can fix a problem, you don't really have to worry about it so much. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think there's also a lot of truth in an awareness that there's a lot of money out there. It's just not necessarily in the right places. But one of the things that I'll say, you know, besides funding, training, building capacity, planning, doing these projects, is that we need a supportive public. I mean, really and truly, and thank you all for coming in your cars and driving out here tonight in a rainstorm, as it turns out, and the folks at home who are watching and listening, because we need your voices in your own communities, at the state level, at the federal level, and there are, you know, a lot of pseudo problems in the world that get a lot of press, and that's, as we know, that's not what's important, you know, in your backyard, frankly. What's important in your backyard are the things that we should be talking about at town meetings and at the State House and, you know, in Congress, and refocusing, you know, all those efforts, all that energy that's out there onto these real problems and helping us move forward into the future. And we can't do that without public support. I mean, we all work way too many hours in a week. And we can only do so much, right? So that's where you folks come into play. And again, I want to thank you all for coming out.
Yeah, so that's a good note. I want to see if anybody else in our room here has one last question. Our panel can answer. No, seeing none. Well, thank you everybody so much for being here and for taking the time to drive out in the rainy storm, and to everybody at home who tuned in on it's Wednesday. Speaking of working too many hours, we really appreciate it, and thank you to the Wells Reserve for hosting us, and to our panelists for making the time. And yeah, I'm Kate at themainmonitor.org if you ever want to talk to me, so you know how to find me, and we'll have this up soon, hopefully posted the video shortly so you can watch it later on. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I don't need to run out into the rain, so if folks have other questions.
Yeah, ditto.
Hot mic quotes.
Jared, I wish I had a bigger megaphone for what you're doing, the work you're doing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank
I just think there's so many people that aren't aware of the stuff, you know, the things that you're trying to do now. Yeah. I mean, I agree with the name trust work, but all this other stuff, I didn't know.
Well, come out with us sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah, come out for a half a day, sign a volunteer form, and I'd be thrilled to take you out into a salt marsh.
Yeah.
Not right now. Let's talk about the summer sometime.
Yeah, no, I still think, you know, people have their wetlands everywhere, and I don't even know if people really know what a wetland is.
Yeah.
Right,
So the town of Kennebunk, I think they recently approved their climate action plan. I don't know if you're aware of that, but there's a cohort of communities in southern Maine that have been working on developing these climate action plans.
I knew they were doing.
Yeah, so those kind of things, and then the state in 2020 created the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan, and they're actively working on updating that now. So there are sort of like local initiatives that are happening, I think at a scale that can produce meaningful results and over the long term. And as Susan mentioned, like it really, you know, speaking as someone who served on the climate task force and helped to create a climate action plan for my town, I can say that it was really helpful to have members of the public show up to meetings. You know, like these are not exciting things that are going on. This is the climate action team presenting to the town council to try to convince them that they need to scrape together enough tax dollars to hire a resilience coordinator for the town, right? So something as simple as that is like establishing a municipal departmental level person whose job it is to latch onto these good ideas about ecological restoration or community sustainability and resilience, and then work with their peers who all do a really good job at what they do, managing infrastructure, keeping their communities safe, you know, teaching children, all the things that we do. Climate planning, ecological restoration, all of that stuff that we do has a place throughout the whole community. And in order to be successful, this way of thinking needs to integrate into all of those different sectors. And that's how we're going to see our communities start to take the shape that we want them to take so that they can be sustainable, healthy places to live going forward.
You were talking earlier in the session about training, you're gonna do some
Yeah.
training programs. Here. Do people like the community development directors come from local towns, do they come to that training, or do people on the planning boards come to that training?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're still in the early stages. So like I said, right now we're targeting engineers because they're sort of on the front line of the design part of building these crossings. But eventually we want to talk to those other audiences, people who whose job it is to say, well, you know, we've got this road and we want to replace it. What are we going to do about it? You know, so a community planner, public works director, ideally town council members, people who are actually like voting on budgets and deciding, you know, where to spend their money.
Conservation Commission,
Conservation commissions,
land trusts.
et cetera. I mean, it's just anybody who is in that pipeline, that decision-making process that leads to building a road crossing or fixing a road crossing, we would like to reach that at some point.
And that public, just as a local elected official, Jake's been working with the town that I live on a project. I haven't been involved in it professionally, but a project with Cape and Scarborough, we're actually looking at removing a section of road that goes through a tidal marsh. And I did not know how that was going to be received. But when we had the public meetings and speaker after speaker got up and said, this makes a lot of sense financially, this is the right thing to do for the marsh, it just made it so easy for both of those councils to do that.
Right.
So that public support really is very helpful at all levels.
Because in that case, instead of putting good money after bad on a road that's failed, we have photos of at least 2 vehicles floating away into the marsh and some of these extreme storms. You stop throwing money at a bad road and put it in places that might be a bad road, but it's critical. It's the only access. It's a major thoroughfare. It's a commercial district. So the budget-wise, that makes a lot of sense. And common sense is so incredibly valuable. So incredible. And sometimes we get wrapped up in our numbers or our approaches. And what we need are voices from the community that say, wait a minute, you know, you want to put a new tourist development down at an elevation where it was underwater in January 13th. You want to put stores down there? Why would you want to do that? Right. And that's a very common sense kind of question based on easily observed, you know, things that are happening right outside our doorways. And so to have a voice of reason, you know, in the audience goes a lot further than you might think.
Well, the storms in January were such, were devastating, but they were so awfully illustrated because the surge was basically 3 feet.
Yep.
Yeah.
If you had this example.
Right.
You could see the whole guys. daily rather than.
Right.
in a catastrophic situation,
Yeah.
highest time of the month.
right,
But so everybody can see, this is the line. I mean, it was eye-opening, certainly in this community.
Yeah.
This is, we're looking in decades in the future and seeing that's what water, it's gonna look like.
Every day.
right. Yeah, that's gonna be the everyday water level. And the storm levels will be that much higher.
So every bridge that was underwater, yeah. This-
Yeah,
it's just
right.
Such a helpful illustration. It's
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It opened a lot of folks' eyes. Yes.
Yeah. But we have options, right? That's, I think, the hopeful note, and we have people who are trying to pay attention. And now that, we've kind of got a slap in the face, I mean, we've had a lot of warnings for decades, but these January storms were sort of the wake-up call. We can move forward deliberately with that information, that wisdom, and not just, hide our head underneath a bushel basket.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.